that the principles don't just apply to learning English as a foreign language or second language, but they also apply to learning how to drive a car, learning the content matter of a subject area, learning how to be a doctor, and all of these sorts of things. I think the basic learning principles apply. And these principles are very, very well researched. And I think that we can now then come to some kind of understanding of how learning activities work. So the main thing that's needed is attention. If you want to learn something, you've got to give it some attention. It's likely that there is learning without giving something very much attention, but it's very fragile learning, and it's a matter still up for debate. Now, I think that there are three things that really matter when we want to learn something. The first thing is the usefulness, clarity, and accuracy of what is focused on. That is, learners need to focus on what is to be learned. And if what they're focusing on is something that is useful, that is clear and understandable to them, and that is accurate, then that will help learning. So focus is the first major group of principles. The second major thing affecting learning is how much attention do we give what we are trying to learn. So the quantity or amount of attention. And quantity comes in two different ways. Quantity means attention at any one time, the amount of attention at any one time, and then repeated opportunities to give attention. And then the third thing that really matters in learning is the quality of attention that we give. So if we pay attention to something in a very thoughtful and deep way, then it's likely to be remembered. If we just give it superficial attention, because they don't really give it much quality in what, just glance at it or something like that, then learning is unlikely to occur or be stable. Now, we can illustrate these three groups of principles in a diagram. So we've got the focus principles, the quantity principles, and the quality principles. And the thick lines in the diagram between joining them together shows that these three things are very closely related to each other. For example, whenever we give attention, we have to focus on something. And whenever we focus on it, we have to give it some quantity of attention, either short or long. And when we give attention, that will have some quality, and that quality will either be good and deep or not very deep and superficial and so on. And so these things are very, very closely related to each other. One can't really exist without the others. But this diagram then is a very simple way of helping to remember these three groups of principles of focus, quantity, and quality. So now let's look at them. Oh, sorry. And there's a distinction made in learning between incidental learning and deliberate learning. So when people use a language for listening or speaking or reading or writing, and say, for example, they do a lot of reading, then you can learn vocabulary through reading. And because your main purpose in reading is to enjoy the reading, any vocabulary learning which occurs is called incidental learning because it's not the main goal of the reading activity. Now, I think that when it comes to the principles of learning, the difference between deliberate attention and incidental attention or incidental learning is not important. The same principles still apply to incidental learning as well as to deliberate learning. So that simplifies things. Okay, so to the first group of principles, the principles of focus. The first principle is we learn what we focus on. So if a teacher wants learners to learn vocabulary, then getting them to focus on vocabulary is a sensible thing to do. This principle is a very powerful principle because It also says that if we want to learn to read, then we should do lots of reading. And if we want to learn to speak, we should do lots of speaking. And so if we want to learn to speak, but we're not doing lots of speaking, then there's not going to be much learning going on, which will help speaking. So it's a very simple, basic principle, but it's a principle that people often lose sight of. The second principle is transfer appropriateness. So we do learning activities. If these learning activities are very similar to the kind of use that we make of language, then that will make the learning very useful. So the closer we can relate what we're doing to the use that we need to make of it, then the better the learning will be. And then the third focus principle is accuracy. Our learning is more useful if the information we are focusing on is complete, accurate, and comprehensible. Now, some activities that learners do in classes, such as collocation activities, are trial and error activities. Here's a list of words, here's another list of words. Which words match up with the other words? And these kind of activities are often done without the learner doing any previous learning related to it, but they make it a trial and error attempt to do it. Now, recent research has shown that it's much more effective for learning if there is some teaching which goes on, or the opportunity to learn goes on beforehand, and then there's a kind of testing activity afterwards. And that's much more effective for learning, because the learners right from the beginning are likely to get things correct, and the learning will focus on something that is accurate. So these then are the focus principles. The very basic principle of focus is simply we learn what we focus on. Quantity principles. And the basic idea behind the quantity principles is that the more we focus on something, the more likely it is to be learned. Now, more can have two meanings here. The most powerful meaning for more is the meaning of repetition. The more often we meet something, the more likely we are to learn it. And so repetition is a really important principle for learning. Now, there are two kinds of repetition. One kind of repetition is what we call verbatim repetition, which means exactly the same thing again. So you look at something and then you put it away, and then you come back later and look at it again, and you're looking at exactly the same thing you looked at before. That's verbatim repetition. Varied repetition it's a qualitative difference, but it's a kind of repetition too, is that we meet the same thing again, but it's a bit different from how we met it before. Now, this is what happens when learners do extensive reading. When learners do extensive reading, they meet an unknown word, and they might look it up, or they might have a guess at its meaning. And then as they continue reading, that word will come up again. And so that then provides a repetition of that word, increasing the possibility that it will be learned. Now, we've done some analysis of texts, of graded reader texts, to look at what happens when words occur again. And almost always the words occur in different kinds of contexts and in different forms than how they occurred before. And this is why extensive reading is quite a good way of learning vocabulary, because it provides repetition of the words that learners need to learn, but it also provides varied repetition. The words are different in some slight way, and this makes them easier to learn. This is actually moving, when we talk about varied repetition, we're actually moving now into quality principles. The second type of quantity is time on task. And that simply means that if we look at something that we want to learn or spend time on it, we can do that in one session. And if we do it in one session, the more that we look at it and give it attention, the stronger the learning will be. Now, some activities that are done in class are simply to spend time on an item so that there is a chance for learners to give it prolonged attention and have a chance of being learned. Repetition and time on task are not alternatives. There are two ways in which quantity can occur in learning, in getting something learned. Now, the third and final set of principles are the quality principles. There is a theory of learning called the levels of processing theory, which simply says this. The levels of processing theory says, if you want to remember something, the only thing that really matters is the quality of the mental activity in your brain at the time that learning takes place. And if that quality of learning is deep and thoughtful, then learning will occur and learning will last. If the level of attention given is rather superficial, then that learning will not last. Now, there are two sort of quality principles, but I've sort of been puzzling over it, and I think probably rather than two, there should only be one, but it doesn't matter. We'll stick with two today. The principle is, the first one here is desirable difficulty and effort. If we give something some attention, we should be giving it the right level of effort in our attention. If it is too difficult, if the things that we have to deal with are just too much for us to understand, then we won't learn. If it's too easy, then we won't give it much attention at all. And the ways of increasing desirable difficulty is by spacing repetitions, by getting learners to do retrieval. And retrieval simply means the learners learn something, and then the teacher says, okay, close your books. Now let's recall or retrieve what we just looked at. And so the learners then have to think, oh, now what did we just talk about and read? And they have to make a retrieval. And so this is getting quality into the attention by making learners recall what they looked at before. Interleaving involves doing an activity, then doing a different activity, and then coming back to the other activity again. And the activity occurring between them then makes the later activity just a little bit more difficult, so that the learners now have to give it more attention. Form recall versus meaning recall. Form recall is harder than meaning recall. So if we have to recall the forms of words, you know, what's the English word for this word? Then learners have to give more deeper attention than doing recall of meaning, where you look at a word form and say, what does this form mean? And variation is what we talked about before, and that is meeting the same thing again, but in some kind of different form, either in different skills such as listening, speaking, reading, or writing. So you met it in reading, now you meet it in listening, and then that increases the level of difficulty of it because you're meeting it through a different skill. If it's a different member of the same word family that you're meeting, that is, you're meeting the word elaborate, and you've already met the word elaboration, then elaborate is a kind of meeting of the same word again, but it's in a slightly different form. And so desirable difficulty and effort really then adds some quality to that processing. Now, if we look at levels of processing, there's deliberate attention. If we deliberately focus on something, then we are likely to give it more thoughtful attention than if it's incidental attention. Elaboration and analysis. Elaboration is things like looking at collocates, seeing the word in the sentence, imagining a visual representation of what you're looking at, or seeing a visual representation of the language that you're looking at. These are all ways of adding new associations to what we're learning. And analysis involves breaking things into parts. So if we look at a word and we can break that word into word parts and then see how the meaning of the parts connect to the meaning of the whole word, then we're increasing the links between previous knowledge and present learning by making these links to word parts which occur through the activity. Okay, so really they are the 7 basic principles which really account for learning. Now let's have a look at, oops. Let's see how you might apply these principles as a teacher. Say you come across a word that the learners don't know in a reading text or in some kind of activity. One way to give attention to the word is to focus on the core meaning of the word. And the core meaning of the word is the meaning that runs through all of the uses of the word. So if we take a word like sweet, what's the meaning of sweet? Now, most people immediately think of taste, but in fact, sweet has a much broader meaning than that. Some people have said that I have a sweet face. Now, that doesn't mean that it tastes sweet. It means it's something which they like. And you can have music, sweet music, or the sweet smell of success. And so you can see that with a word like sweet, and with most other words in the language, there is actually a core meaning which runs through all of its uses. And when teachers focus on the core meaning of a word, then they automatically are applying some of the principles. So if we look at the principle of focus, we are focusing on the meaning of the word. Now, how useful is that for the learner? Is learning the meaning of a word something which they'll then be able to use? Is it something which is comprehensible for them? If it is, then that's a good application of focus principles. Does focusing on the core meaning of a word allow the learner to spend more time looking at that word? Does it increase the quantity of attention? And I think it does, because when you look at the core meaning, instead of just getting a straight translation, you're saying, oh yes, okay, this is sweet and that's sweet and that's sweet and that's sweet. You're now spending time on that word, so it's more likely to be learned. And then it's also satisfying the quality principles because it's giving thoughtful processing to that word. You are now increasing the different kinds of associations you have with that word. You know that sweet can apply to music, sweet can apply to taste, sweet can apply to appearance. And so this then is adding quality. So therefore, the activity of focusing on the core meaning of a word is quite a good activity for learning because it provides good application of focus, quantity, and quality principles. Let's just pick another one from this list. Let's break the word into parts, because some of us looked at that yesterday. If you meet a new word and you see that the word has a prefix, a stem, and a suffix, perhaps, is it a good idea then to break the word into parts? Now, from a focus perspective, this is okay because you're focusing on a word that needs to be learned. But in terms of language use, you know, when we meet words in language use, we don't often break them into parts when we see them and do those sort of things. So it's probably not a great application of focus principles. Certainly in terms of quantity of attention, it's a good idea, because when you break a word into parts, you have to spend time looking at that word, cutting it up, looking at the meaning of the parts and so on. So you're spending time on it. And it's quite a good idea, probably an excellent idea from a quality perspective, because you are now saying, look, here's a word, but this word actually relates to other words you already know, which contain similar parts. And because you know the meaning, or now you're going to learn the meaning of these parts, this is really going to help you relate lots of different words to each other and thus help them stick in the memory. Okay. I lived in Indonesia for a few years, and in the afternoon, I used to hear a sound coming from the house next door. And the sound was like this. It would go, And I thought, oh, these are very religious people living next door to me. You know, they're sort of, I thought they were praying. And then when my Indonesian got a bit better, I actually listened and I could understand what they were saying. And it was actually a child about 11 years old, and she was saying, she was holding a book and she was saying, in the year 1945, Indonesia gained its independence. And so she was chanting her textbook, and that was her way of studying. Now, when you think about it, the parents thought, oh, what a good child. Here she is each day getting the textbook, chanting the textbook. But if you then apply the principles of learning to what she was doing, it's actually not a very good activity at all, because she's certainly focusing on what's in the textbook, but it's focusing on it on a rather superficial level. She's giving it some quantity of attention. It's quantity of in terms of time on task, but it's not really repetition. But there's a little bit of quantity of attention there. And then when you look at the quality of what she's doing is looking at the words, turning the words into a spoken form, and then letting them come out. Now, if she read her book, read a couple of paragraphs, and then closed her book and said, now let me do retrieval. What can I remember of what I just read? That would be much far better for learning. And because she is now spending more time on the same piece of material, that is, she's lingering over a piece of knowledge in the book, and then she reads it, and then she has to recall it, and then she might look back to check that she's got it right. So she's now putting more sustained attention into what she's doing. And then if she did something like, 1945, in the middle of the street, there's a monument which has 1945 on it, celebrating independence. If she related that in some way to something that she knew, then she would be really deeply into quality of processing. And the learning would be much, much better than simply the superficial chanting of what she was doing. Okay, let's move on. Applying the principles again, but looking to later meetings of the words. Some ways of applying these principles are simply, if you're looking at vocabulary, get the learners to recall the form of a word. So once you've dealt with some words, then get them to recall the form by giving them the meaning, and they have to recall the form. And you can do a similar thing by giving them the form and getting them to look at the meaning. Another thing is to do during intensive reading, to look at a word in context that they've met before, and then to examine the context of the word. Now, each of these activities, we should be able to look at them and say, what is the focus that learners are making when they look at the role of the word in context? Are they focusing on the word form? Is that useful? Is that what we want them to learn? Are they focusing on the context of the word itself? Is that what we want them to learn? Is this focus involve spending quantity of time on what we're doing? And is the quality of what we're doing, the way we are focusing on it, providing thoughtful processing or not? Okay. We can also look at some broader activities. When you work with young learners who are learning how to read, in New Zealand, they use a little technique which is called pause, prompt, praise. And that is, you sit next to your learner and you get the learner to read aloud to you. And when they reach a spot where they have trouble with a word, instead of the teacher rushing in and providing the word, then the teacher then pauses to give the learner a chance to retrieve the spoken form of the word they're trying to read. And that's good, because that idea of retrieval the focus is exactly right, because what you have to do when you retrieve is to retrieve a spoken form of the written form that you're reading. In all reading, there is some spoken element, even though it doesn't occur aloud in most cases. If the learner can't make a correct interpretation, yeah. Go on. Sorry, Dylan, do you have something? No.
Oh, that wasn't me, Professor.
If the learner can't make a correct interpretation, then the teacher might prompt them by saying the beginning of the word, and thus giving them, once again, spending more time on it, quantity principle, and then giving them a chance to retrieve again through this prompt, which is a quality principle. And if they get it right, then you get some praise, and that's got nothing to do with those principles that I've looked at. If we look at dictionary use and extensive reading, there's often an argument about when learners do extensive reading, should they use a dictionary or shouldn't they? Now, in my mind, it's very clear learners should use dictionaries in extensive reading, because when you look up a word when reading, then the focus is correct because you get accurate information about the word. You're not getting wrong information or no information about the word. You're getting accurate information about it. If you have a go at guessing from context before you look up the word, then that involves spending quantity of time on the word. And then when the learner does have a guess at it, then there is a quality of processing involved in that, because then you are relating that word, the dictionary word meaning, to the other word meaning that you've got from the context. And if we look at something like dictation, that's also similar too. You know, how does dictation help learning? The typical dictation activity is to listen to something, listen to a text, then listen to it phrase by phrase, and then while the learner's write, and then listen again to do checking. And so you can say, are we focusing on what needs to be learned? Is there quantity of attention going on to the language which is in the dictation? And what level is the quality of attention when we focus on it?
Prof. Paul?
Okay. So in this talk, we've looked at learning from teaching. I think the same principles apply to learning through language use, such as learning through extensive reading, extensive listening, conversation, writing, fluency, and fluency development across the 4 skills. I think teachers need to understand, and learners also need to understand these very basic principles of learning. And it's only a small number of principles, and then consider their learners' learning and their own learning in how to make sure that these principles are applied. And using the 4 strands to balance the opportunities for learning helps balance the application of principles for learning. If I was testing you on what I'm talking about today, one of the things I'd do is to say, look, here's some application of the principle, write the number of each principle next to the application. Or how does extensive reading help vocabulary learning? What principles of focus, quantity, and quality occur to help learning through extensive reading? And just to show that it extends beyond that, if you are learning the rules of the road to get your driver's license, how would you apply the principles of focus, quantity, and quality to learning the road code? And I think they should all be fairly obvious. Okay, that's it.
Prof. Paul?
Yep, I'm happy.
We have some questions in the chat, actually.
Yep, okay.
All right, so shall I read them to you?
Yeah. Yes, okay, you go, you read them, Dylan.
All right, we have a question from Mary where it says, do repeated encounters with vocabulary require deliberate attention each time, especially involving different word classes, in order to facilitate learning of the new vocabulary?
Ideally, there should be a balance of different kinds of attention to vocabulary. vocabulary should be learnt across the 4 strands of learning through input, learning through output, through fluency development, and also for giving deliberate attention. So I think we need a balance between deliberate vocabulary learning activities, which are very efficient, and activities which involve incidental learning of vocabulary.
All right, Prof. Paul, also there's another question by Padmini. As Padmini asks whether would you have any suggestions on how to accomplish the principles that you mentioned earlier in large classes in contexts like India, where average class sizes run up to 50 students?
Yeah, I think that the same principles apply no matter what your class size is. I think when you have very large class sizes, you need then to organize the learning that occurs so that a lot of the learning is really individualized learning. So I think things like activities like extensive reading, extensive listening, deliberate learning of vocabulary using word cards, doing speed reading activities, and so on. The teacher needs to really organize the class into groups which suit, and the grouping should suit the levels at which the different learners are working, and then make sure that each learner is working at the level which is appropriate for them. For me, the main job of a language teacher is not to teach. The number one, I think the language teacher has 5 main jobs. The number 1 job is to organize the learning. And that is to make sure that the learners are learning at the right level for them and having a right balance of kinds of activities for learning. And I think the number 5 job of the language teacher is to teach. And only a small amount of time in a language learning class should actually involve the teacher getting up and deliberately teaching. There is too much teaching going on and not enough organized learning.
All right, thank you, Prof. Paul. That's all the questions for now, but just a reminder for everyone to keep the questions coming if you have any.
Okay, no, it's fine. The basic idea between what I've been talking about today is simply that learning doesn't occur through magic. Learning occurs because we have conditions of focusing on something, giving quantity of attention to it, and then adding quality to that attention in various ways. And it's really important for teachers to look at the various qualities of attention. Oh, I see, it's going backwards now. Looking at the various qualities of attention that you can give here, because in the levels of processing, I distinguish elaboration and analysis. Elaboration means seeing a word in a context sentence, seeing some kind of picture or video form associated with the word. And analysis involves looking at how words fit into patterns, breaking words into parts, and doing those kinds of thoughtful activities. When, for example, teachers and learners talk about a reading text during extensive reading, there can be a lot of thoughtful processing going on in vocabulary when learners do intensive reading, talking about a word, what job the word does in the paragraph or the passage that you're looking at, and how the word relates to other words in the passage, and so on. And learning of that vocabulary and of that word occurs simply because you're focusing on the word, you're giving it quantity of attention, that is, you're spending time on it, and then you're enriching or adding quality to this by adding other pieces of knowledge which are closely related to what you're studying. So I hope that these principles, the principles of focus and quantity and quality, are things that you'll think about not only with your classroom, but also with learning outside the classroom. Okay, I think that's fine. Okay, Dylan, is there anything else, or shall we?
Thank you, Prof. Paul, for the workshop. And actually, right now, if would just like to ask the general participants whether is there any more questions that they have. If there are no questions, then by now we can actually
I think we have to move to the next workshop.
Sorry, Dylan. Sorry, I just
Sorry?
may I have just ask one last question?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, my name is Halima. Hello, Prof.
Hello.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes. My question is probably out of topic because I'm just wondering, in your preliminary speech just now, you mentioned about native speaker, yeah?
Yeah.
The model is like we encourage students to speak like native speaker. Could you just
I didn't say that, but go on.
sorry about that, Prof. Maybe I misunderstood it. But what kind of native speaker that we are referred to? Yeah, is it the one intelligent or just a normal person? Sorry about my English. Thank you, Prof.
No, I don't think that learners have to speak like native speakers in terms of pronunciation. I think that there are so many different pronunciations of English throughout the world that learners, learners from different countries will probably have their own pronunciation of English. But I think in terms of fluency, it's important that learners of English have language goal of at least, for example, being able to read at the speed of the average native speaker, around about 250 words per minute, of to be able to speak at the speed of roughly a native speaker, around 150 words per minute, and so on. And I would set those goals of speed as being native speaker like goals. And I think that's simply, you can set the goals to say, well, they're like a native speaker of your first language as well. So you should be able to speak the first language at roughly the second language at roughly the same speed you speak the first language. But I'm not an advocate of everybody speaking like a Brit or an American or a New Zealander or anything like that. That's not something I'm advocating. I noticed in one of the chat things, I think it was Pauline, talk about the rote memorization and regurgitation. I think regurgitation is a fairly negative word, but I'm very much in favor of rote memorization of vocabulary. I think that the rote learning of vocabulary, where you learn the English word and its first language translation, is a highly effective way of learning. And there is now research which shows that rote memorization results in both implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge. And because it's such an effective and efficient way of learning, I think it should be part of a language learning course. That's applying to vocabulary. I don't think it works for grammar, because I think grammar seems to be learned and seems to be dealt with in ways which are different from vocabulary learning. But I wouldn't see rote memorization as a bad thing. I see rote memorization of vocabulary and probably collocations as being a very good thing.
Prof. Paul?
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question from the chat, where someone asked if you could go over the process of how you do dictation.
How you do what, sorry?
Dictation.
Or dictation?
Yeah.
The traditional way of doing dictation, which I think is probably a good way of doing it, is simply that you have a dictation passage, probably about 100 or so words long, and then you read it at a moderate speed to the learners, read the whole passage so that they can try and comprehend it as a whole text. And then it's broken up into phrases of somewhere around about between 5-7 words per phrase, but you try and do the breaks according to grammatical breaks within the paragraph. And as the teacher reads each phrase, the teacher then pauses for the learners to write it. And then once the learners have written the whole text, phrase by phrase, the teacher then reads the whole passage again so that the learners can check what they've written as a way of double checking. Now, this is a deliberate learning activity, and you can say it works because, first of all, you're focusing on comprehending the spoken form of the language, which is a good focus, and then turning it into a correct written form as a way of getting feedback. That's a good focus too. There's quantity of attention, because you're paying attention to the same text at least 3 times, probably 4 times if you allow learners to check their dictations with each other after they've done them as a way of correcting them. And then you're getting a certain amount of quality of attention, but the quality of attention is probably not very deep in terms of dictation. But in terms of quantity and focus, it's a good activity.
Hi, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm Mina. All right. Hi, Professor Paul. So, questions here is, nowadays, I think that students nowadays, they do not like to use dictionary to search for the meaning of the vocabulary. So, teachers are more to like spoon feeding for the students. I mean, they will teach the vocabulary. They will tell the students what's the meaning of the words and then how to use the words, the vocabulary. So in fact, I don't think it's a good way, because the students only receive, but they don't learn it. They receive the information, everything. So in this case, how do we overcome this problem? Which I think they need some activities, is it, to enhance their strength? Yeah.
Learning through reading really needs to involve 2 kinds of reading. Well, no, let's say 3 kinds of reading. One kind of reading is what we call intensive reading, when the teacher and the learners, or various combinations, work together to understand the text. And then the teacher might try to explain the vocabulary before reading, although the research doesn't support pre-teaching as having a strong effect on vocabulary learning. But that's one way of giving attention, through the teacher teaching the words and all the learners working on the same text. And that's intensive reading. And that should make up a small part of the reading course. Probably no more than about, let's say, less than a quarter of the reading course. At least half of the reading course should be extensive reading, and probably about 3/4 of the reading course should be extensive reading, where learners read at the right level for them. And each learner might be reading a different book, and they're reading silently, they're reading by themselves, and they're reading for understanding. Learners are often reluctant to begin doing extensive reading because they feel it's too difficult, but that's simply because they haven't got material which is at the right level for them. And extensive reading courses should actually begin in the classroom with each learner and the teacher. I'd give them a vocab test beforehand to see what their vocab size is, so the teacher can then recommend what level of graded readers or what level of material they should be working with. And then each learner should then be encouraged to do their individual learning. And then for several weeks, the teacher would get them to do this in class time, keeping an eye that they're doing it, and then hoping that the success that they have in doing it will then carry over to doing it outside of class time. The amount of reading, that extensive reading that learners need to do, can be covered in class time. It's feasibly possible. but it's quite good if you can free up class time by eventually getting learners to do it outside class time. If you look around on my website under publications 2015, I think it is, I tried to calculate how much extensive reading that learners would have to do in order to learn vocabulary through extensive reading. And it turned out that the number of minutes per day wasn't enormous. It was something that could be managed within a language course quite well. So you really need then to see your, and then you also need fluency development in reading, and learners need to do either a speed reading course and combined with doing really easy extensive reading easy books, but reading them fast. So you need to have a balance of those three kinds of reading, and the idea of the dictionary helps a learner. In extensive reading, the dictionary is really important for the learner, but electronic dictionaries are fine. And if you read in Kindle, you can just touch the word and get the meaning anyway. And so it becomes, you know, I find I read in Kindle now, and I learn quite a lot of vocabulary by just touching the unknown words that I meet, and you get it straight away. So I'm quite happy to do it. Whereas before, I wouldn't go and look at a dictionary too much, mucking around. I want to continue reading. But nowadays, with electronic reading, it's brilliant for vocabulary learning.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I think we need to move now, Dylan, don't we, to Stephen's plenary?
Yeah. All right, everyone. So thank you so much, Emeritus Prof. Paul, for the workshop. And everyone, I would just like to inform you that now we'll be moving on to the final part of the plenary webinar, and I will be putting the link into the Zoom chat box, and it will be starting now. So you all can click the link, and we shall see you there in the plenary Zoom link. Thank you, Prof. Paul, once again.
Thank you.
For the great workshop.